to this current session, which is to learn a little bit more of some key NRCS programs. And for this training particularly, we're going to do a little focus on the Conservation Reserve Program as well, which is within the Farm Service Agency, not within NRCS. So we are very lucky today to be joined by 4 people. The first, and we're going to do this in the order in which they're going to present, Michael Margot, who's the National Grazing Lands Coordinator with NRCS. He leads the partnerships with groups like the National Grazing Land Coalition, or what I've learned is called NAT-GLC. That's something I learned for this training. He also manages the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative, which actually has a notice of funding availability out right now. I know he can't talk much about it, but he can talk about that a little bit. I believe that Michael is Texas-based, so welcome, Michael. And Michael's going to go first because he has to leave early. We then are going to hear from Nick Siravatka. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Nick is a regional soil health specialist as part of the NRCS soil health team. He's going to talk a little bit about practices and technical assistance available through NRCS, particularly as Seth mentioned in the session right before, there is a significant amount of new money out there on the street through the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's probably valuable for us all to know what kind of practices are being funded, and so how can we connect the landowners and producers we work with to some of that funding opportunities. We are then going to hear from Katrina Thompson and Patrick Lewis. Katrina is the NRCS National Conservation Reserve Program Manager, so she provides guidance from the NRCS perspective on CRP. And Patrick Lewis is a West Regional Specialist with Farm Service Agency, not with NRCS, associated with both Conservation Reserve Program and the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. And the two of them are just going to talk us briefly through CRP and those opportunities and how to plug in the right ways. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and let me turn it over to you, Michael, and we'll do questions right after yours because we know that you have to go. So turning it to you, Michael, wherever you may be.
Okay, hi, Chris. Thank you. And I believe I shared my PowerPoint with Jamie. So
they're going to queue it up right now.
Okay, excellent. All right. Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jamie. A pleasure to be here. I'm Michael Margot. I'm the National Grazing Lands Coordinator for NRCS. I'm based out of Fort Worth, but I happen to be in Washington, D.C. today. So happy to be here. Next slide. Okay, in my role, I'm basically a liaison with many of our grazing land partners and organizations that Chris mentioned, like NAT-GLC, National Grazing Lands Coalition, but others include National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Society for Range Management, American Forage and Grassland Council, basically a lot of national organizations that we partner with, and this is just some of them, a few of the larger ones that I serve as a liaison with within the grazing discipline. And a lot of these organizations have a unique mission statement, and but are similar in the ways that they advocate on behalf of livestock producers and support sound range and pasture management by providing a platform for disseminating information through publications, conferences, and workshops. Okay, next slide. So I'll focus. I was asked to kind of just focus on NatGLC, and sometimes there's a confusion between NatGLC and GLCI, and I'll talk about GLCI in a little bit. I know a lot of abbreviations here, but and acronyms. But NatGLC is a nationwide nonprofit organization providing technical assistance on privately owned grazing lands. NatGLC works to increase the awareness of the importance of grazing land resources, and NatGLC is an advocate for producer needs and resources for education and networking. It's a producer-led and driven organization made up of a producer board members representing 13 member organizations, and the activities through GLC are carried out through a network of state coalitions. And there's the website for NatGLC for more information. Okay, next slide. And they're currently, and it's growing because they've had a few additions, and apologize, it's a small slide, but you can actually see it if you go into their website for their 2023 annual report is where I got this photo from. But they have 26 state coalitions across the country. And these are coalitions of producers and ranchers that work together and organize pasture walks and extend technical resources, workshops. They get a lot of outreach and technical assistance out on the ground for other producers in the state. Texas, for example, is a large state that has multiple grazing coalitions, even just within the state for different part of the region. And the some advantages of being part of these grazing coalitions, they can apply for grants from NatGLC, these mini grants to host workshops and conferences and trainings ranging from soil health, grazing management, and everything related to managing grazing lands. Okay, next slide. And just an example, like I said, there's this is a Texas Grazing Lands Coalition photograph. Some of the members of the state level coalition giving training to, and in this one in particular, is they're demonstrating the rainfall simulator for a youth during a youth workshop. Next slide. Now, many of you probably heard now of GLCI, and NatGLC used to be called, NatGLC was formed in the late 1990s, and their original name was GLCI because the Grazing Land Conservation Initiative was funded early on as an initiative, and then it wasn't funded for a period of time until just recently. And GLCI is separate from the organization NatGLC. NatGLC ultimately changed their name to NatGLC, but it's a coordinated effort within NRCS to identify priority issues, find solutions, and affect change on private grazing land, and enhancing existing conservation programs. We're looking at leveraging partner capacity and expertise and technical assistance to expand the footprint of well-managed grazing systems across the country. It's a strategic and comprehensive approach to support grazing systems, specifically reach new and underserved producers and address climate change. A couple of our key priorities within our agency. Also, the GLCI also supports, provides support to NatGLC so that NatGLC can strengthen and grow and be a resource for state level coalitions. Okay, next slide. So, how do we leverage our partners? And it's through funding. So in fiscal year 22, there was, and it rolled out in FY23, $12 million was made available of GLCI funds, was made available for a notice of funding opportunity for grazing land technical assistance, for partners to apply for grants. And last year we awarded 49 projects. We were really impressed at the number of applications that came in. A lot of very excellent projects came in, and there were organizations from across the country, not just state level grazing coalitions, but it's open to land grant universities, nonprofits, and currently all these projects are currently happening right now. They're active. There's a lot of great workshops, pasture walks, and resources and activities and information going out to ranchers in many parts of the country. And again, many of these projects had to identify climate smart ag and forestry practices, and they also had to target historically underserved producers, target all producers, but specifically include historically underserved producers. And I could have put a link, but you could do a search under GLCI FY23 awards, and you can find a summary of all the 49 projects that were awarded. If you're curious and wondering, hey, are there any projects in my state or the state that you're at? And there's some contact information, and you can find out, okay, what type of projects or resources are available in my state through this project. And currently, right now, FY24, we have another round of GLCI funds made available. This time it combines FY23 and FY24 funding for a total of $22 million for cooperative agreements for another NFO. And it's currently online on grants.gov. There is the link. To maintain the competitive integrity of the grant proposal. I cannot go into details about it and answer specific questions on what is eligible and what is not. But there's a lot. If you go into that the grants.gov website, a lot of information there on eligible activities, how to apply, and who's eligible to apply, things like that. But it's all focused on increasing acres of grazing acres under grazing management, increasing technical assistance to farmers and ranchers, and reaching historically underserved producers, incorporating climate smart agriculture and forestry. And it's all, many of the education activities are very much involved. So, and I also provided a link to the a news release that kind of just talks about GLCI. And these partnerships help us expand that footprint of conservation on grazing lands and helping reach underserved producers. Let's see, next slide. Okay, yeah, so I had a brief presentation here. Just wanted to touch up on NatGLC, the organization. GLCI, the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative, and that effort that we've been managing within the agency. I could open it up. I have maybe a few minutes for questions. I apologize. I do have to leave in a few minutes. And
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Michael. Let me kick things off with a question. On those state grazing coalitions, or in those states that actually have multiple coalitions, are those coalitions a good one for these land conservation staff to be plugging into? Like, are they the ones who are providing the kind of technical assistance or can guide land trust staff to where is the best place to send a producer for technical assistance around?
Yeah, I think that would be a great resource. Those 26 states that have coalitions, they're affiliated with NatGLC, and there are many other states out there that also have grazing coalitions or others that may not be affiliated with NatGLC, or they may be other groups. But yes, though they're producers from that state that are extremely knowledgeable of that state. It's producer driven, so they would be the source for each coalition. Usually has a website, a list of calendar of events happening throughout the whole year. And many have a staff of folks that manage the coalition, and some are a lot bigger than others. But yeah, that would be a great resource for many in the audience here, wanting to find out, what's happening in the state. Where's some areas that would be they're producers. There's ranchers in the state who know the state well. If they have questions about the state, about specific ranches, specific areas. So they're a great resource. Okay,
great. Thanks so much. Other folks, questions for Michael? I'm curious whether anybody is connected to their state grazing coalition, and if so, have they found it to be a useful resource? Anybody on that front?
Well, maybe just not yet, right?
Maybe not yet, right. And I would assume, Michael, I know that you can't answer details, but I did read in that, in the notice of funding opportunity, that it is open to a 501c3 organization. So conceivably, again, I'm not asking you to comment on this, but a land trust or conceivably a state or county program focused on land conservation, if they were significantly expanding and capable of expanding their focus on soil health or pasture improvement, they would theoretically be eligible to apply, correct?
Correct, right.
Okay. Understanding that this is that the purpose of this program is to be providing that direct technical assistance. So it may not be something that would be, I don't know how to say this. I'm trying not to ask you a question that you can't answer, but theoretically they could apply, but the focus of the initiative funding is to fund those entities who are doing direct technical assistance to landowners, correct?
But, and I could talk about a lot of the past projects that were funded, like last year. The organizations were encouraged to partner with other organizations, so you'll see a lot of that, a lot of projects. If you read at the FY23 funded projects, you'll see many organizations are joint, working together it's because one organization has a strength in something versus another organization has another strength. Combining forces, they can get a lot of good work done.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's helpful, right? Because that then gives these folks, these participants here, some good thinking about who they might be able to partner with potentially. So thank you for that. Any other questions for Michael before we let him go? Because we know he has to run. All right. Well, you all have his contact info.
Yes.
So thank you ever so much, Michael. It was really, it was good to have you join us. We really appreciate that information. So appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yes. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you.
All right. Will do. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Okay. And now we are moving to Nick Siravatka. Nick, I hope you will correct me if I've not pronounced that correctly. And again, I believe Nick is based in Oregon, correct, Nick?
That is correct. Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
And that the states, I took this off of a website, that the states that you are directly responsible for are Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Utah, and you're part of the Indigenous Practices team, correct?
That's actually an old list. I have Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Oregon. But yes, I am part of the Indigenous and Tribal Practices team with the NRCS.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us. And take it away.
Absolutely. Well, it's good to be here. I'm sure you guys have been sitting staring at PowerPoints all day long, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, now I have somebody else that's going to share PowerPoints with me. But hopefully this is going to be informative and helpful to allow you to figure out how to connect with soil health. And let's see if I can get my screen to share. There we go. All right. So in today's discussion, I want to talk briefly about how to access NRCS opportunities, funding opportunities through our Farm Bill programs. In talking to Chris earlier this week, it sounded like you guys had been made aware of or had a conversation about the Farm Bill programs, the EQIP Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and the CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time focusing on the program, but I do want to just make sure that as you're working with clients, as you're working with producers, there's some basic requirements that need to be met in order to gain access to Farm Bill program opportunities. And the start is to go in and visit with the Farm Service Agency folks and make sure that the land units are established in the system so that NRCS can see them, and we can work with you on specific land units and come up with conservation practices and implementations in order to solve or address conservation resource concerns that may be present in the land unit. Now, super broad, I know. Hopefully, if we need to get deeper into that when we get to the question and answer section, I can provide a little more detail or provide better clarification. But NRCS is as broad as we are. We cover every county in the country, and in most counties we have a field office with staff designated to help serve the producers and individuals that work with and for producers. So we have a very wide network. Now, for the rest of today, really what I want to focus on is looking at some specific practices and then also some specific opportunities that tie into planning activities, implementation activities, and monitoring activities. So in 2022, we as NRCS changed our terminology, but not really our approach. So we changed from a CAP plan to a CPA plan, or a conservation planning activity plan. And to start out, I really want to focus on on 116, the Soil Health Management Plan. Now, when we think about how NRCS develops plans, we in NRCS have a 9-step process to develop those plans. And all of these plans are going to be focused on working with producers to solve resource concerns. You know, the funding that we have through the Farm Bill program is taxpayer dollars. So we have to show some benefit to applying that tax resource into conservation agriculture. And one of the great things that we have with the opportunity of the IRA funding is the Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Mitigation activity list. And that list is a specific set of practices that NRCS has established that have a specific focus or a specific purpose to address climate smart or climate mitigation, climate adaptation concerns. But before we get to addressing specific practices, we have to understand how NRCS develops our plans. And really, we start at the beginning with number 1 on this screen, but we look and we evaluate, we understand what's going on and what the future goals are for the operation. We inventory the resources, we analyze the data, and then we develop alternatives so that we can put in front of the producers or individuals like you who are working with and for producers. We can put some alternatives in front of you so that you can make a valued judgment on how you're going to move forward with your conservation effects or benefits. We're going to implement the plan with number 8 on this screen, and then 9 is going to be our monitoring activities. We're going to make sure that what we did is useful, effective, and valuable. So it all starts with 116 when we talk about soil health. Now, you don't have to have a soil health management plan or a CPA 116 plan in order to implement specific practices on the land that you are caring for. However, when you think about the flow of making sure that we're doing the right thing in the right order, a soil health management plan really makes sense. It identifies the physical, biological, and chemical properties of the soil, and then identifies conservation practices that can help to address some of those resource concerns that may be present. I do want to call out that soil health management plans, and really all of the practices that I'm going to focus on are available on annual and perennial cropland, pasture, and range ground. So a lot of areas that it sounds like this group is specifically targeting, specifically working with. These 116 or soil health management plans do fit in well. What we're going to do as NRCS when we put together a 116 is we're going to go out and we're going to evaluate the benchmark conditions and understand what the direction of the operation is going. We're going to identify the resource concerns that we can attach our conservation practices to, and we're going to come up with the alternatives that folks can implement on their ground. Now, I do want to call out, and this may be a shameless plug to try to get more technical service providers or TSPs involved in the system. But the way NRCS has this 116 plan set up is that a technical service provider is going to be the liaison between the NRCS and the land manager, the land owner. That TSP is going to do the legwork, going to collect all the data, going to do the evaluations, do the on-site inventory, look at all of the NRCS tools and protocols in order to address those resource concerns. Now, I say a shameless plug for TSPs. We need more TSPs in order to really have these soil health management plans be effective and efficient and moving out. So as you're looking at this slide, you're thinking about how can I connect my company, my entity, the producers that I work with NRCS, one of the ways is to become a TSP and help with developing these soil health management plans. Now, I said that when we address, we as NRCS, when we address the resource concerns, we have specific resource concerns for soil health. These top bullets that you see here: soil organic matter depletion, soil compaction, soil organism habitat loss or degradation, and aggregate instability are really the main resource concerns that live within the soil health division. That doesn't mean that many of the other resource concerns don't have a touch or don't have a feel in what soil health resource concerns do. You know, you look down the sheet to the sheet and rill erosion. Well, obviously, if your soil's leaving the field, leaving the area that you're working with or responsible for, then we have a soil health resource concern. It just doesn't live within the specific soil health realm of resource concerns. Now, the 116 deliverables, all of the items that are required are really set to build a good, solid plan that you can take as a land manager and go through, understand how those deliverables were put together, how the alternatives were structured, and then go back and have a frame of reference as to where the land unit was and where it's going. And as we get further down through this presentation, we'll see some of the monitoring opportunities. Now, some of these evaluations that I have listed here really don't make a whole lot of sense to be used within the realm of a grazing operation or a grazing system until you start thinking about, okay, hayland, you know, how long is the hayland going to be viable for before we have to pull it out and address putting new varieties in, new species in, sweetening the planting? You know, what do we have to do? Well, at that point, then we're looking at potentially some disturbance of the soil, some disturbance of the ground. So it may make sense that we have some of these that have to go into some of these non-range land evaluations that have to go into the plan. But we're going to look at a whole gambit of evaluations in order to make the best recommendation possible that we can. One of the things I have highlighted in the middle of this screen is the interpreting indicators of rangeland health. That document has been used by NRCS and probably many of you for years. NRCS Soil Health Division is in the process of finalizing and publishing a in-field soil health assessment for range document. And it's going to look very similarly to what the in-field cropland assessment is going to do. It focuses, though, on the characteristics of an active, functioning, working range unit and what soil health resource concerns may be causing a less healthier or less beneficial positive range system. So that's coming, should be out very soon within the next, I'm going to say it should be, if you don't have access to it now, it should be out within the next 2 months. It should be available for you and the NRCS counterparts that you may work with to utilize. When we think about the soil health management plan, you know, we really want to make sure that the producers that are in charge of managing that land are comfortable with the practices that we have identified. So as we put these plans together, we're going to identify a couple of alternatives. And as we move forward into our design stage, only agreed to practices, only the practices that make sense for that producer at that point in time of their operations goals are going to be included. Now, I said a shameless plug, and I'm coming back to it. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Right now, there's only 23 TSPs across the country that are writing these soil health management plans. Now, there's a little bit of requirement to sign up to go through the tech reg system in order to be a TSP for soil health management plans, but we made it so that it is accessible and easy for folks that are working with producers to do that and to provide a value-added service to their participation. I really thought that this group would be a good spot, or a good group to put that in front of as an opportunity for value added for your producers. Now, once we develop our soil health management plan, then we come back and we start looking at the practices that were agreed to and how are we going to implement those on the ground. So we get into the soil health management design, or the DIA 162. And really what this does is take the 116 plan and puts those practices into action. And at this point, NRCS is going to provide financial funding, financial aid to the implementation of the practices. Before, we were looking at providing technical services, providing the evaluations, but now we're looking at actually getting conservation on the ground. And there we go. So as we think about design and implementation of these practices, we really do need to focus on what is soil health and how does soil health work within the system or within the ecosystem of range management. And the 4 principles of soil health, NRCS has been standing on those since 2012, 2013. Minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing the presence of living roots. Well, that works really well into the range, hayland, pasture land world that you guys work and live in. So we're already checking that box, that we're working towards that presence of living roots. We're looking towards minimizing disturbance, but we really need to think about, okay, what does that minimizing disturbance mean? What does that living root mean? Are we maximizing the potential for those living roots? And that comes into play, or that's where practices and implementation of practices come into play. And this is a fairly small screen, but if you look down on the primary practice code, so as you're looking at the screen on the left-hand side, we have forage and biomass planting, we have prescribed grazing, we have range planting. We have opportunities to directly affect or directly influence what that grassland, what that grazing land looks like. We have up at the very top of that left-hand column, we have practice 216, soil health testing. But then we jump across over onto the right-hand side and we look at all of the supporting practices that, may not be as attractive or jump out in your head and say, that's something that I need to do, but it absolutely facilitates the beneficial use or the productive use of these range units. If you don't have watering facilities, if you don't have spring developments that can provide opportunity for livestock to utilize different areas, we're really hamstrung on how we can address or how we can manage the soil health. So we have primary practices and supporting practices. Now, these lists, you can find these lists if you search for NRCS practice standards. In the second slide that I showed, I had a link for the climate smart mitigation list, and I'll provide that link in the chat as soon as I'm done with this presentation. But be looking at and be looking or thinking about how those standards might fit into your system, and absolutely think about what supporting practices may come into play in order to correctly or properly implement those primary practices. Now I'm getting a little long, so I'm going to jump across this, but the 162 deliverables that would be provided to you or provided to the landowners that you're working with, are going to have all of the instructions, all of the design requirements or implementation requirements, as NRCS calls them, the IR sheets, in order to properly implement those practices to NRCS standards, so that there's not any issues with how are you going to get paid for the conservation practices that you're implementing. Now, this one also is a TSP required practice, and across the country, there's only 16 TSPs that have become certified in the DIA 162. So another great opportunity for folks to come into play and provide value added benefit to the entities that they work with. Now, soil health testing, SEMA 216. Really what we're looking here is we're using this as an evaluation point to understand what the benchmark is or where we're at, and then how the practices that we're actually employing or utilizing are helping to benefit the health of the soil in order to make it more productive or allow it to moderate some of the climate or weather extremes that we seem to be seeing more and more often. Now, I do want to point out the third bullet down here. This changes from a TSP to a qualified individual. Now, a qualified individual does not have to go through the TSP or the technical service provider registry, but that doesn't mean that a qualified individual cannot be a technical service provider. So keep that in mind. The four numbers below that QI requirement shows us how you can become a QI for 216. I'm not going to read that list to you, but really it is experience and understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're going to accomplish it. Really is going to be what the qualified individual for 216 are going to need to do. All right, so as you're working with 216, as you're trying to document the baseline for our first soil health test, there needs to be an interaction or involvement with the QI, NRCS, and the landowner, so that everybody is aware of what's going to be done, how it's going to be done, how payments are going to be made, and how we're going to set up a plan to monitor in the future, if that is a goal of the producer that you're working with. So make sure that as you're working with your landowners, working with your land managers, you're thinking about, okay, I need to contact NRCS. I need to talk to them about what I'm interested in. I want to understand what my benchmark conditions are, and then we want to implement our practices in order to address resource concerns. And moving forward, we want to see how those practices hopefully positively affected our soil health. So really, I don't need to go over this. I think I covered it all, so I'll jump out of that. But when we do this, when we think about this, we really need to understand, and the qualified individual needs to understand the sampling strategy that they're going to employ, and then what lab they're going to send the test to. That's very important right now, because not all labs are up and running and conducting all of the required tests. So making sure that you have a lab in mind that you're going to send your samples to in order to have the evaluation done is very important. Yeah, so just real briefly on this, and I know I'm getting long, and Chris, I apologize. I'll try to speed up through the next few slides, but make sure that you're looping in and talking to local NRCS and just having that conversation early in the process. So the other practice, or the last practice that I really wanted to focus on, that is new and I think fairly exciting, and ties back into the climate smart mitigation, is the soil organic carbon stock monitoring, or the SEMA 221. And really what we're using this SEMA for is a nationwide benchmark of where we're at in different systems, different management systems, where we're at with carbon storage potential, and what protocols we can use to evaluate that carbon stock in the soil. Applicable land uses, that's important in NRCS speak, because that tells us where this practice can be used. And as you can see on the bullet here, all land uses can be contracted with the SEMA 221. Again, this is a QI requirement. It is not a TSP requirement. So as long as you have the experience and can document your credentials on the cover page of the SEMA, you're eligible to provide this resource to your producers. This is a duplicate slide just talking about how the qualified individuals need to understand the NRCS specs. If you can't find it, reach out to the state NRCS technical specialists or the county district conservationist, county staff, and they can point you in the right direction. So there's two sampling options. Right now we have a very intensive sample process going on that is being administered out of 4 universities across the country. But that doesn't mean that those intensive samples are the only ones that are being utilized. We do have 2 other options. One of them is the citizen science, and that's where we're seeing a lot of interest coming from land managers and individuals that represent land managers, looking at sampling locations, small scope sampling locations, but looking at sampling locations on their farm. Sampling protocols, just really quickly, you can use a probe or a shovel, but each one has very specific requirements. The qualified individuals, as they are looped in, will understand those requirements based off of the documentation NRCS has. And with that, I see Chris online telling me that my time is up, so I'll say thank you and stop talking.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was super helpful, and it's good to know that for folks that it's helpful that while the TSP part of it is a challenge, that there is the availability of a soil health management plan and soil health testing, and I assume all of those things also through the Inflation Reduction Act, that things like that would be considered climate smart, and there is plenty of funding for things like that, right?
Yeah, so the climate smart funding is actually more looking at puting conservation on the ground, right, rather than developing the management plans. Gotcha. But yeah, absolutely, all of those practices that you'd use would live within that climate smart plan.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, let me do this because we're running just a little bit behind. Let's go to Katrina and Patrick, and then if there are questions, if people have questions for Nick, feel free to put them in the chat and we can answer them that way. But let me now turn, I believe, Katrina, that you were probably going first. I'm not quite sure. You and then
Patrick. That's me. Thank you, though.
Patrick, you're going first. Beautiful. Okay. So welcome. Thank you for joining.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we also emailed our presentation, and it would be great if I didn't have to be responsible for it.
We are on it. I believe that Beth or Jamie is going to show it.
What did you name it, Patrick? Do you remember?
Yes, give me just a second.
Beth, it's the session 12_CRP.
Yep, thanks.
So while that's coming up, I will just mention that I'm gonna give a very brief, like high level overview about CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, and it's up, so we can get going. And I will probably talk too fast in order to get through what we've got, so I apologize ahead of time. But if we go to the next slide. So if you may or may not know that CRP is the largest private land conservation program in the United States. It's administered by my agency, Farm Service Agency, supported by NRCS and then U.S. Forest Service through some agreements that we've got. Producers, landowners offer private land or certain other lands to be taken out of annual production for a period of 10 to 15 years. And then we pay annual rental payments, cost share, and then potentially incentives in exchange for establishing and maintaining perennial cover. So like grasses, forbs, lagoons, trees, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of every flavor of CRP. So what we just wrapped up for this year is general CRP. That's where we do take those lands out of production, put them in long-term cover, and just manage that cover over that 10 to 15 year lifespan. Then we've got continuous CRP, which isn't generally whole field. It's looking at specific resource concerns like filter strips, buffers, wildlife habitat, that sort of thing. And then what my other hat is running grassland CRP, which is a more working lands focused program where we want folks to either be managing that through grazing, haying, keeping it maintained for wildlife, or even just leaving it idle. One thing I will mention, like I said, we just wrapped up general sign up for the year. Continuous sign up happens throughout the year. And then in the next couple of weeks, we'll be kicking off our grassland sign up for the year. And then down below, there's some other initiatives in continuous. You may be familiar with SAFE, State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement, or CREP, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which is FSA's park program. We have just under or right at 40 projects in, I believe, about half the states in the nation. So next slide, please. So we look at eligibility. We have to qualify the land, and that's either through an owner or an operator. So they have to have the land for at least 12 months prior to the time of that offer. And then each one of our signups has slightly different requirements because heaven forbid we have one size fits all. So for general CRP, that's generally going to be cropland. That's almost exclusively going to be cropland. So that has to have cropping history of that annual crop or some sort of other approved cropping history 4 of the last 6 years during 2012 to 2017. Those are set by statute and they generally roll with each successive farm bill. Grassland CRP requires that grass stand already exists at the time of the offer. We're not doing establishment in grassland. And then continuous CRP and CREP, they're going to meet what we generally call needed and feasible rules. So is that thing that we're going to establish, is that cover that we're going to stand up needed on that land, and is it even feasible to plant there? And then, like I mentioned a couple of times already, the majority of these programs are going to require establishment of that cover, and then grassland and any re-enrolled contract, like a second time through, that's going to require maintenance and potentially enhancement of that cover. So next slide. So we make, as one of the things I mentioned, we make annual rental payments. We make them in arrears. So if you sign up something that started 10/1/2023, your first contract payment is going to be middle of October this year. So, we're always, and then if we do a partial year payment, same story. If you sign up today to get into CRP and your contract starts next month, your first payment is going to be October the following year. Generally, our soil rental rates are determined by the 3 predominant soils, and then a lot of our continuous and even some of our general, depending on carry incentives. And so you might get, your 3 soils might average out to $100 an acre, and based on what we're doing, you might get an additional $10. So that's an easy way to look at it. The grassland rate is supposed to mimic about 75% of the grazing value unless we utilize a minimum rate, which we have for the last couple of signups. And then for the majority of our participants, there are a couple of exceptions. There is a $50,000 per year annual payment limit on that rental payment. This doesn't include cost share. It's just that annual rental payment. And then, like I mentioned, if we are making you plant the cover, we're going to pay you 50% of what we think the cost of that should be. And obviously, we're constantly reviewing and revising those rates to make sure that we're trying to match the real world there. Next slide, please. So, some of the incentives that I mentioned in continuous, this is mostly where we see them. We have what we call a sign up incentive payment, and that's to incentivize just actually the contract happening. And then we also have a practice incentive payment, and that is incentivizing establishing the practice. So the sign up is a one-time, but after the first full year, it's 32.5% of the annual rental payment. And then the PIP gets split into two pieces. You get 40% at the time that we determine that the cover is established or you've done whatever we need you to do. And then you get the last 10% at the midpoint of the contract. CREP, our partner program, it's going to carry with it a bunch of separate incentives that each partner, whether that's a state, local, non-government entity, tribe, whoever that partner is, they want specific things to encourage enrollment. So they're going to set up specific incentives. Most of our CREP projects include those. So next slide. One thing I did want to mention is easements. I know the focus of this is maybe to look at other options aside from easements, but it is something that comes up a lot, so I wanted to touch on it real briefly. If the land is encumbered by an easement prior to that landowner, farmer, other tenant wanting to make an offer into CRP, we look at what that easement is doing. If that easement, like let's say it's for grassland, it's a grazing piece of property, and that easement says that producer couldn't till up that grass and plant corn, it's already got a resource conserving measure. It's already protecting from conversion, which is exactly what CRP is in part doing. So that land's probably not going to be eligible. But if it is allowing the wide range, the full range of agricultural activities, that easement may be eligible. Now, if it's gone into CRP first, and then we're talking about putting an easement on it, we have a little test that we run through. We make sure that the participant can continue to comply with their conservation plan, which is what are you doing over the life of your contract? And then we work with that other entity to make sure that they were aware that we have the CRP, that we can continue it and all that. And then generally those contracts can't be re-enrolled into CRP, but they can live out their original contract lifespan. Next slide. And then I'm going to turn it over to Katrina for the last little bit. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Patrick. NRCS coordinates with FSA because we provide the technical assistance related to CRP. So CRP is a tool in our conservation planning toolkit that we might explain to a producer that CRP might be a good fit for their situation and what they want to accomplish with a CRP conservation plan. Nick went through some of the planning process, which was good to see. Some of you probably already are familiar with that. So that was touched on earlier, but that's what NRCS does, is to discuss with the farmer their goals with the CRP program. Or we would ask them, prescribe to them to go to FSA and sign up for a certain flavor of CRP. Many of the conservation practices that we do are conservation cover. So those are the grasses, forbs, shrubs, trees. All of those, as we've heard earlier, are really good for soil health and for climate mitigation or climate smart practices. CRP is, a very effective program to put permanent cover back on the land. And there have been some changes to the policies related around grazing of CRP. And so folks that do have CRP, and if their land is fenced and they have some water sources, they can actually use some grazing on a routine basis to manage their CRP. And also it's offered for emergency haying and grazing for many different natural disasters. Next slide, please. So the technical assistance that we like to provide would be meeting with the producer out in the field and talk about their goals. And like Nick had outlined in some of the soil health and some of those plans, CRP might be a really good fit. There's a bunch of practices that fit in the CRP practices. And so we could always work with one of those larger soil health plans and have CRP provide some government dollars to help the person implement some of these practices across their operations. They do a lot of these vegetative practices. They create a lot of organic matter, which increases carbon sequestration and builds soil health. And also there's a water quality benefit, and also we get pollinator habitat through CRP. We get more wildlife habitat, which is also very beneficial. All right, next slide. Practice management is important, and NRCS helps the producer with that. So we want to manage the practices in order to maintain their use on the landscape, so maintain healthy plants and vigorous plants. And maintenance is also required, and it is not cost shared, but will help by maintaining these stands. You're going to improve your soil health, reduce soil erosion, and improve wildlife habitat. So NRCS can use CRP in conjunction with other NRCS programs, but they cannot be on the same footprint of land. So we don't layer these on top of each other, and that's due to statute. And many of the fields that rotate out of CRP stay in that permanent cover. There are many studies out there that look at how many are converted and how many are put back to agriculture land, and it depends on the market, as we know, but a lot of times, hopefully these are marginal lands that will be kept in permanent cover for a very long time. Next slide. That is the end. We made ours as quick as we could here. So we just wanted to touch briefly on how CRP can be used across the landscape, and hopefully some of you do have CRP or will be able to talk more about it to some of your folks.